A unanimous Supreme Court ruling just redefined what occurs the next time emergency lights appear behind your vehicle, and hardly anyone is discussing it yet. 9 justices complete agreement, establishing a boundary that directly impacts every single driver who lawfully possesses a firearm in their car. And here's the part that should make you pause. Most individuals won't learn about this decision until after it becomes relevant, until they're already stopped, until an officer is positioned at their window, until a completely standard traffic stop begins moving in a direction they didn't anticipate. Because in that instant, there's a split-second choice that determines everything. Whether your protections actually safeguard you or whether they quietly vanish. And what makes this even more serious is how confusing this ruling can be if you only grasp half of it. On the surface, it appears like a massive victory. And it is. But underneath that headline is a set of requirements, restrictions, and pressure points that can completely reverse the outcome against you if you don't know exactly how this functions in the real world. There are instances during a stop where this decision can shut everything down in your favor immediately. And there are instances where one statement, one action, or one incorrect assumption makes it worthless. So before you ever find yourself on the roadside trying to figure it out in real time, you need to grasp exactly what just changed and, more importantly, what remained the same. Hi, I'm Sofia, and I examine major legal rulings like this in a way that actually prepares you for what occurs outside the courtroom, where these decisions either safeguard you or fail you entirely. Because what just emerged from the Supreme Court isn't just another legal headline. It's something that directly impacts how law enforcement can engage with you the instant a firearm is involved in a traffic stop. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to guide you through exactly what the court stated, why all 9 justices concurred, which almost never occurs in cases like this, and the critical details most individuals will overlook that could cost them everything in the incorrect situation. I'll also reveal the specific instances during a stop where this ruling functions in your favor and the exact circumstances where it doesn't apply at all. And there are 3 specific pitfalls built into this that you need to grasp completely, because they're the exact points where things go wrong for individuals who believe they're protected when they're not. To comprehend why this ruling matters as much as it does, you have to comprehend the tension that's been building for years beneath the surface of something as ordinary as a traffic stop. Because on paper, your protections are very clear. The Second Amendment provides you the right to keep and bear arms. That's not vague. And for millions of Americans, it's something they exercise every single day lawfully, responsibly, and without incident. At the same time, the Fourth Amendment safeguards you from unreasonable searches and seizures. That means the government cannot examine your vehicle, your belongings, or your property without a warrant or a very specific legal justification known as probable cause. 2 protections, both fundamental, both non-negotiable. And yet, out on the road, those 2 protections started conflicting in a way that created a serious legal concern. Because here's the question that kept arising in courtrooms across the country. The instant an officer discovers that there is a firearm inside your vehicle during a traffic stop, what does that actually permit them to do next? Does that information alone provide them the authority to search your car, even if you've done nothing wrong, even if the firearm is completely legal, even if there are no other indicators of criminal activity? That question might sound straightforward, but the responses coming from different courts were anything but, and that's where things started to get serious for law-abiding gun owners. Some lower courts began constructing a legal theory that at its core treated the presence of a firearm as inherently suspicious. The reasoning went like this. Firearms are dangerous by nature. If a firearm is present, then the situation carries an inherent risk. And if the situation is inherently risky, then an officer should have broader authority to ensure their safety, including searching the vehicle. On the surface, that might sound like a precaution, but in practice, it created something far more concerning. It turned lawful conduct into a justification for government intrusion. It meant that simply exercising your Second Amendment protection could be used against you to diminish your Fourth Amendment safeguard. Think about what that actually means in real terms. You're following the law, you're possessing lawfully, you're not suspected of any offence, and yet the mere presence of that firearm could be treated as authorization for a search. No warrant, no additional evidence, no specific reason to believe you've done anything wrong, just the firearm. And once that logic starts to take hold, you're no longer operating with two separate constitutional safeguards. You're being forced into a compromise. Possess your firearm or maintain your privacy, but not both. That's not how the Constitution is supposed to function. Those protections are meant to coexist, not eliminate each other. But this wasn't just a theoretical debate occurring in law schools. It was playing out in real traffic stops with real consequences. And it was expanding more cases, more rulings, more circumstances where lawful gun owners found themselves being treated as if they had already violated a legal line simply because of what they had in their vehicle. And the deeper this trend went, the more it started to reshape conduct on the ground. Officers didn't need to articulate much beyond the presence of a firearm. Courts were increasingly willing to accept that as sufficient. And for the average individual, that created a situation where the rules weren't just unclear, they were shifting quietly but significantly, because if the standard becomes firearm equals search, then every traffic stop involving a lawful firearm carries a built-in risk that has nothing to do with actual wrongdoing. That's the environment this case emerged from. Not one isolated incident, but a growing pattern that was starting to obscure a constitutional boundary that's supposed to be very clear. And once that boundary starts to obscure, it doesn't stay contained. It expands, it gets tested, and eventually it forces the highest court in the country to step in and decide once and for all where that line actually exists. The case that finally forced the Supreme Court to step in didn't start with anything dramatic. No high-speed pursuit, no major criminal investigation. It started the same way most of these situations do, with a routine traffic stop. The kind you've either experienced yourself or could experience any day. A minor violation, something small, the kind of stop that should be over in a few minutes with a warning or a citation and nothing more. The officer approaches the vehicle. The interaction begins normally. The driver is calm, cooperative, not behaving erratically, not providing any reason to escalate the situation. At some point during that exchange, it becomes clear that there is a firearm in the vehicle. The driver doesn't conceal it. He doesn't act suspiciously, he discloses it or it becomes visible. Either way, there's no indication of illegal conduct. This is a law-abiding citizen exercising a legal protection. And then the instant happens that changes everything. The officer decides that the presence of that firearm is sufficient to justify going beyond the traffic stop, sufficient to search the vehicle. No warrant, no additional evidence, no specific facts pointing to an offence, just the firearm. The driver objects. He doesn't consent. He knows his protections, or at least he believes he does, but the search occurs anyway. Now, here's where this becomes larger than just one stop on the roadside. The case moves through the court system, and instead of correcting what occurred, the lower courts uphold it. They side with the officer. They accept the argument that the presence of a firearm by itself created a sufficient safety concern to justify the search. In other words, they validated the idea that being a lawful gun owner could make you inherently suspicious in the eyes of the law. That's the instant this issue stopped being isolated and became something the Supreme Court had to address. Because if that reasoning stands, it doesn't just affect one driver. It rewrites the rules for millions of individuals. So the case reaches the highest court in the country. And what occurs next is something you almost never observe, especially in a case involving firearms and law enforcement authority. Every single justice across ideological lines, across legal philosophies, examines the same set of facts and reaches the same conclusion. 9-0. No dissents, no fractured opinions, complete agreement. That alone should tell you how clear the court believed this boundary needed to be. And here is the core of what they stated. This is the part you need to comprehend word for word. The mere presence of a legally possessed firearm in a vehicle does not by itself establish probable cause to search that vehicle. Not maybe, not sometimes, not depending on the officer, does not. That is a direct line drawn by the Supreme Court of the United States. What that means in plain terms is this: lawful gun ownership is not suspicious activity. Possessing a firearm legally is not evidence of an offence, and law enforcement cannot treat it as if it is. The court made it clear that you cannot use a citizen's exercise of one constitutional protection as the justification to remove another. The Second Amendment and the Fourth Amendment are not in competition with each other. They stand together. And when all 9 justices agree on something this specific, it sends a message that goes far beyond this one case. It tells every court, every department, every officer in the country that this is not an unclear area anymore. The line is defined. Possessing a weapon does not mean criminal. Now, before you assume that this ruling settles everything in your favour the next time you're stopped, there's something you need to comprehend, because this is where most individuals get it wrong, and it's where situations start to fall apart fast. The part of this ruling that matters most, the part that will either safeguard you or fail you completely, comes down to 2 words that are easy to overlook: by itself. The court did not state that a firearm can never be part of probable cause. They stated it cannot be the only reason. And that distinction is where everything changes, because the instant you add anything else to that situation, anything an officer can point to, describe, or interpret, the legal analysis shifts immediately. What felt like a clear safeguard can start to narrow fast. And this is exactly where individuals get caught off guard. They hear 9-0 Supreme Court ruling and assume they're covered across the board, but this is not a shield, it's a boundary, and boundaries only function when you comprehend exactly where they begin and where they end. So before you ever rely on this ruling, you need to comprehend the first major limitation, who it actually safeguards. This decision applies to lawful gun owners. That word lawful is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. If you are legally permitted to possess a firearm, this ruling stands behind you. But if there is any question about your legal status, any at all, the entire situation changes. If someone is prohibited from possessing a firearm due to a prior conviction, a domestic violence restraining order, or any other disqualifying condition, the presence of that firearm is no longer neutral. It becomes potential evidence of an offence. And once that occurs, the officer doesn't need to rely on this ruling because the foundation of the situation is completely different. The safeguard only exists when your protection to possess that firearm is fully intact and unquestioned. But here's where it gets more subtle and more serious for individuals who think they're doing everything right. Even if you are legally permitted to possess, that doesn't automatically mean you're in compliance with every law that governs how that firearm must be handled. And that brings us to the second layer most individuals overlook, where otherwise responsible gun owners run into serious concerns without realizing it. Because legality isn't just about whether you can have the firearm, it's also about how you're possessing it, how it's stored, and whether it complies with the specific laws of the state you're in at that exact instant. And if it doesn't, the entire dynamic of that traffic stop can shift in seconds. Every state handles firearm storage in vehicles a little differently, and those differences matter more than most individuals realize. Some states require the firearm to be unloaded. Others require it to be in a locked container. Some regulate whether it can be within reach of the driver. And then there are states where the rules change depending on whether you have a permit, what type of permit you have, or even how the firearm is positioned inside the vehicle. It's not always intuitive, and that's exactly why it becomes a concern, because from your perspective, you might be doing everything right. You legally own the firearm. You're not committing any offense, you're simply driving from one place to another. But from the officer's perspective, if that firearm is stored in a way that violates state law, even slightly, that's no longer a neutral fact. That becomes a specific, articulable reason to believe a law is being broken. And the instant that occurs, the Supreme Court ruling you're relying on doesn't apply in the way you think it does. The search is no longer about the presence of a firearm. It's about the unlawful manner in which it's being possessed or stored. This is where a lot of otherwise careful, responsible gun owners get caught off guard. Not because they intended to break the law, but because they didn't realize how specific and technical those laws can be, depending on where they are. And in a traffic stop, there's no time to figure that out. The officer is making decisions in real time based on what they observe, what they're told, and what they know about the law in that jurisdiction. If something doesn't line up, even slightly, that's all it takes to shift the entire encounter. And then there's the third pitfall, the one that gets used most often because it's the most flexible. It's what's known as the totality of the circumstances. And this is where the firearm, even though it cannot stand alone as probable cause, becomes part of a larger picture that an officer can use to justify a search. Imagine a stop where everything seems normal at first. You're possessing lawfully. The firearm is stored correctly. On its own, there's nothing there that justifies a search. But now add a few small details. A passenger who appears unusually nervous. A faint odor that the officer believes could be tied to a controlled substance. Responses to simple questions that don't quite line up. None of these things individually may be sufficient, but combined, they start to form a narrative. And that's exactly how it's framed. The officer won't state the search was because of the firearm. They'll state it was because of the totality of everything they observed, the conduct, the environment, the statements, and yes, the presence of a firearm as one piece of that larger context. The Supreme Court did not eliminate that type of analysis. It didn't remove an officer's ability to interpret a situation based on multiple factors. What it did was remove the ability to rely on the firearm alone as the sole justification. That distinction is critical because in real-world scenarios, stops are rarely judged on a single detail. They're judged on the combination of everything occurring in that instant. And once multiple factors are in play, the safeguard from this ruling becomes narrower and more dependent on how that situation is interpreted after the fact. Which brings us to the instant where most of these encounters are decided, not by the law, not by the court, but by a single question that sounds simple on the surface and ends up overriding everything you just learned. That instant comes when the officer looks at you and asks a question that sounds harmless, almost routine. Do you mind if I take a look inside your vehicle? It's calm. It's polite. It doesn't sound like an order. And that's exactly why it's so effective, because in that instant, it feels like cooperation is the right move. You want to demonstrate you're not a concern. You want to get through the stop quickly. You want to avoid tension. But what's actually occurring in that instant is far more significant than it sounds. Because if the officer does not already have probable cause, this is the point where they try to get around that requirement entirely by asking you to provide it to them. And the second you state yes or sure, or even something as casual as I guess that's fine, everything changes. The Supreme Court ruling we just walked through, the one that states a firearm alone cannot justify a search, no longer matters. You've just replaced constitutional safeguard with voluntary permission. And once that occurs, there's no undoing it. In a courtroom, it won't matter that the officer didn't have sufficient to search your vehicle. What will matter is that you permitted it. That's why this is the most serious instant of the entire interaction. Not when the officer approaches, not when the firearm is mentioned, but right here, when it feels like the easiest thing to do is state yes and move on. And to make this even more effective, officers are trained to apply just enough pressure to make refusal feel uncomfortable. You might hear something like, "If you've got nothing to conceal, why not just let me take a quick look?" It's designed to shift the burden onto you, to make it feel like stating no is suspicious, but lawfully it's not. Refusing consent is not evidence of wrongdoing. It is the exercise of a constitutional protection. So if you remember nothing else from this entire breakdown, remember this. Consent overrides everything. If you provide it, the safeguards you're relying on disappear immediately. Now, let's shift from theory to practice because knowing the law only helps if you know how to apply it in real time. The instant those lights come on behind you, the way you handle the next 60 seconds sets the tone for everything that follows. Pull over safely and promptly. Don't delay. Don't create uncertainty about your intentions. Once you stop, turn off your engine. Roll down your driver's side window completely. And if your windows are tinted, roll down the others as well. If it's dark, turn on your interior light. These small actions remove one of the biggest sources of tension in any traffic stop, the unknown. Then place your hands flat on the steering wheel, where they are clearly visible, and keep them there. Do not reach for your license. Do not reach for your registration. Wait, because from the officer's perspective, those first few seconds are about assessing risk. An unexpected movement, especially toward areas where a firearm might be located, is one of the fastest ways to escalate a situation that didn't need to escalate. When the officer approaches and requests your documents, that's your instant to communicate clearly and calmly. If your registration or identification is anywhere near where a firearm is stored, you need to state that before you move. A simple, controlled statement changes everything. Officer, my registration is in the glove box, and I want to let you know I am legally possessing a firearm. How would you like me to proceed? That statement does more than individuals realize. It demonstrates cooperation, it removes surprise, and most importantly, it puts control of the situation into a structured, predictable process. You're not guessing, you're not reaching, you're asking for instruction. And in most cases, that immediately lowers the temperature of the interaction because now the officer knows exactly what's occurring, and more importantly, what isn't occurring. But even when everything is handled correctly up to this point, there's still a critical part of the interaction where most individuals lose control of their position. And it occurs not because of what they do, but because of what they state next. What you state during a traffic stop matters just as much as what you do. And in many cases, it matters more because once the initial interaction is under control, the next phase becomes verbal questions, small talk, clarifications. And this is where a lot of individuals, without realizing it, start constructing the very case that can be used against them. It usually doesn't feel like an interrogation. It feels casual. Where are you coming from? Where are you headed tonight? Is there anything in the vehicle I should know about? On the surface, these seem harmless, but each response provides the officer more information to work with, more context to interpret, and more opportunities to identify inconsistencies or construct suspicion. And remember, once multiple factors come into play, the safeguard from that Supreme Court ruling starts to narrow. This is where restraint becomes your advantage. You are not required to respond to investigative questions unrelated to the purpose of the stop. You can respond calmly and respectfully with something simple like, I'd prefer not to respond to additional questions. No attitude, no escalation, just a clear boundary. Because the goal in that instant is not to convince the officer of anything. It's to avoid providing them material they can later use to justify expanding the stop. And one thing that cannot be stressed enough, never provide false information. Not to make things easier, not to avoid discomfort, not to speed things up. A single false statement can turn a routine stop into a separate legal issue immediately. What could have been a simple interaction becomes something far more concerning. And at that point, none of the safeguards we've discussed will matter in the same way. Now we come back to the instant that defines everything, the request to search. Because this is where your response determines whether your protections stay intact or quietly disappear. When the officer requests, "Do you mind if I take a look inside your vehicle?" Your response needs to be clear, calm, and controlled. Not defensive, not argumentative, just direct. "Officer, I respect the work you do, but I do not consent to any searches of my person or my vehicle." That's it. No explanation, no debate, no references to the Supreme Court or your protections in detail. The roadside is not where legal arguments are won. It's where positions are preserved. If the officer follows up with pressure, If you've got nothing to conceal, why not just let me check? Recognize what that is. It's not a legal requirement, it's a psychological tactic, and your response doesn't change. I'm exercising my protections and I do not consent to a search. Then you stop talking. Silence in that instant is not awkward. It's strategic because every additional word creates an opportunity for misinterpretation, contradiction, or escalation. Most individuals try to talk their way out of discomfort, and in doing so, they hand over exactly what an officer needs to justify going further. By staying calm, by being clear, and by knowing exactly when to stop speaking, you keep control of your legal position without escalating the situation. You're not resisting, you're not being difficult, you're simply not providing away protections that the law is already safeguarding for you. And even with all of that handled correctly, there's still an unclear area that causes confusion in real-world stops because officers do have certain authorities tied to safety. And comprehending where those end and a search begins is where this ruling becomes especially important. There's a line in the law that often gets obscured during traffic stops, and it revolves around something called officer safety. Courts have long recognized that traffic stops can be unpredictable, and because of that, officers are provided a certain amount of authority to control the situation. This includes the ability to request you to step out of the vehicle to reposition you or to take limited actions to ensure that the immediate environment is secure. That part didn't change with this ruling, but here's where the confusion and the overreach often occurs. That authority is limited. It's meant to address immediate safety concerns, not to open the door to a full search of your vehicle. Before this Supreme Court decision, the presence of a firearm was often used to stretch that safety concern much further than it was supposed to go. Officers could and often did argue that because there was a firearm in the car, they needed to check the entire area within your reach, and in many cases, courts permitted it. What this ruling does is tighten that boundary. It makes it clear that a legally possessed firearm on its own is not sufficient to justify expanding a safety check into a full evidentiary search. If an officer wants to go beyond basic safety measures, they now need something more, something specific, something articulable, something that points to an actual threat or a violation of the law, not just the abstract idea that a firearm exists. That distinction is where this decision has real weight in the real world because it forces a separation between I want to make sure this stop is safe and I want to search this vehicle. Those are not the same thing, and now they can't be treated as if they are without proper justification. But even with that line clearly drawn, there will still be circumstances where an officer moves forward with a search after you've refused consent. And if that occurs, what you do next matters more than most individuals realize. Your instinct might be to object physically, to block access, to argue in the instant, but that is exactly what you do not want to do. Because the second a situation becomes physical, the focus shifts away from whether the search was lawful and onto your conduct, and that can create a completely separate set of concerns that overshadow everything else. Instead, you stay controlled, you stay composed, and you make one thing clear verbally so it's captured on body camera and recorded as part of the interaction. I am not resisting, but I do not consent to this search. That statement matters because it draws a clean line between compliance and permission. You are not interfering, but you are also not agreeing, and that distinction becomes critical later if the legality of that search is ever reviewed in court. From that point on, you let the situation play out. Every action taken after that, every step the officer takes, every place they examine, every item they touch becomes part of a record that can be challenged. If the search was not justified, anything found during that search can potentially be suppressed. But that only functions if your conduct during the stop didn't complicate the situation. This is where discipline matters more than emotion, because in the instant, it can feel wrong. It can feel unfair, but your goal is not to win the argument on the roadside. Your goal is to safeguard your position so that if something crosses the line, you have the strongest possible case afterward. And once the stop is over, there's one more step that almost no one takes, but it can make the difference between a weak case and a strong one. The instant that traffic stop ends, when you're back in your car and driving away, it might feel like everything is over. But if anything about that interaction felt off, unclear, or pushed beyond what should have occurred, That's actually when one of the most important steps begins. And almost nobody does it because memory fades faster than you think. Details that feel crystal clear in the instant start to obscure within minutes. The exact words that were used, the sequence of events, the tone, the timing, all of it starts slipping. And those are the exact details that matter if that stop is ever questioned later. So before you've gone 5 miles down the road, take an instant and document everything you can remember. The time of the stop, the location, the officer's name and badge number if you have it, what you were stopped for, when the firearm was mentioned, whether you were requested for consent, whether you provided it or refused it, the exact phrasing of key instance if you can recall it. These details are not small. They are the foundation of how any legal review of that stop will be evaluated. Because if something crossed the line, your ability to clearly explain what occurred accurately and consistently can determine whether that line is recognized in a courtroom or dismissed entirely. And by the time you're trying to reconstruct it days or weeks later, those details are much harder to recover. Now, there's another layer to this that becomes especially important if you ever travel with a firearm. And it's one of the most overlooked risks in situations like this. Because while this Supreme Court ruling applies nationally to how your Fourth Amendment protections are interpreted, it does not create a single unified set of firearm laws across the country. Every state still has its own rules, its own definitions, its own requirements for possessing, transporting, storing, and disclosing a firearm. And those rules can change the instant you cross a state line, sometimes in ways that aren't obvious unless you've looked them up ahead of time. A permit that's valid where you live might not be recognized in the next state. A method of storage that's completely legal in one place might be a violation somewhere else. Even something as simple as where the firearm is positioned inside your vehicle can shift from compliant to unlawful depending on the jurisdiction. And the instant your possession becomes unlawful, whether you realized it or not, the safeguard from this ruling disappears. Because again, this decision safeguards lawful possession. It does not override state-specific laws, and it does not apply when those laws are being violated. That's why preparation matters before you ever start driving. If you're traveling across state lines, you need to know exactly how each state you're entering handles firearm laws. Reciprocity agreements, storage requirements, duty to inform, all of it. There are tools and resources that make this easier. Applications, official state websites, but the responsibility ultimately falls on you to know where you stand lawfully at every point in that trip. Because in the instant of a traffic stop, there's no time to figure it out. The officer is going to apply the law as it exists in that state, not the one you came from. And if there's a mismatch, even an unintentional one, that's all it takes to change the entire interaction. And when you step back and examine everything we've covered, it leads to one final point that ties all of this together. What this ruling truly provides you, and what it still depends on you to do correctly. What the Supreme Court did here is significant. There's no question about that. A unanimous 9-0 decision drawing a clear constitutional line is not something you observe often, especially in an area as complex and debated as firearms and law enforcement authority. The court made one thing absolutely clear. You do not have to choose between your Second Amendment protections and your Fourth Amendment safeguards. You are entitled to both at the same time, fully, without compromise, without trade-off. But what the court did not do, and this is just as important, is remove responsibility from the individual exercising those protections. Because this ruling doesn't operate in a vacuum. It doesn't automatically safeguard every situation. It doesn't override state laws. And it doesn't fix mistakes made in the instant. It safeguards lawful possession. It safeguards clear boundaries. And it functions best when the individual on the roadside comprehends exactly how to operate within those boundaries. That means staying calm when it matters most. Keeping your hands visible, communicating clearly before you move, not volunteering unnecessary information, not providing false information, not consenting to searches, comprehending the laws of the state you're in, not the one you came from. Because the second any of those pieces fall out of place, the safeguard this ruling provides starts to diminish. And that's the part most individuals never hear. They hear the headline. They hear 9-0 Supreme Court decision. They assume that's sufficient. But protections don't enforce themselves. They depend on how they're used. So now go back to that instant we started with. You're on the roadside, lights flashing behind you, an officer walking up to your window. In one version of that instant, you're unsure, you're reacting, you're making decisions under pressure without a clear comprehension of what safeguards you and what doesn't. And that's where things go wrong. Not because of intent, but because of uncertainty. In the other version, you already know exactly how this functions. Your hands are steady, your responses are controlled, you comprehend when to speak, what to state, and when to stop talking. You recognize the instant consent is being requested, and you know exactly how to respond. You're not escalating the situation, but you're not providing anything away either. That's the difference this information makes. Because at the end of the day, this ruling didn't just define a legal boundary, it provided you a tool. And like any tool, its effectiveness depends entirely on the individual using it. Used correctly, it safeguards you. Used incorrectly or not comprehended at all, it might as well not be there. Most individuals won't take the time to learn this until after something goes wrong, after the search, after the charge, after the instant has already passed. But you're not in that position anymore. Now you know where the line exists. And more importantly, you know how to stay on the right side of it.